have invited speakers from all of these countries so that our viewers and participants in the conference can form their own judgment by hearing from the representatives of these countries directly, something which you never would get from the mainstream media, and also making clear that the interest of the countries of the global south and the interest as it is expressed by the international peace movement in the so-called global north are really identical, because both are united against this apparatus which is driving the world towards World War III. And that equality or that similarity in interest has to be understood by both sides. So, hopefully we can, with that mobilization, appeal to rational forces in Europe, in the United States, who would understand that it would be in the best interest of everybody, if this confrontation would stop and there would be an orderly reorganization of the financial system, which is urgent. I mean, we are sitting on a powder keg. If you think that what happened with Silicon Valley Bank and some other minor American banks, and then the incredible development with Credit Suisse, where, Credit Suisse was bailed out one day with 54 billion Swiss francs. The next day, it turned out that this was not sufficient. So there was enormous pressure from many sources, but on the Swiss government and on the Swiss, basically central bank, that UBS would take over Credit Suisse. Now, this is an incredible danger to Switzerland, because they have now a super mega monster bank, which has basically a volume of 40 times the GDP of the Swiss economy. Now, it should be obvious that if something happens, like a chain reaction in the international market, which would wipe out this new monster bank as well, the Swiss people would be the ones who have to pay with an incredible economic loss. And that is in the wings, because this was not a unique example or situation. There are rumors that some German banks have incredible derivative exposures. I'm not going to say which ones, because this is a tricky question. I don't want to have a suit, but we have insider information from people in the banking area who are extremely concerned about the entire transatlantic financial system and describe it, as a casino economy which is about to blow. So, so we have the war danger, we have the pending collapse of the financial system, but we have an alternative shaping up. And what we have to accomplish is that the European countries and hopefully the United States realize in time that, we have to overcome geopolitics and we have to find a common solution, which is why the Schiller Institute is promoting this idea of a, new security and development architecture, which must take care of every country on the planet, and where the new word for peace is development, because there can be no peace if we don't address the absolute urgent questions of poverty, of, health problems, of lack of food, lack of clean water, all of these things. So this is, where we are at. And I think that, you should really join this conference and help us to spread the news about it, because that is the place where more and more forces are turning to discuss how to get out of this situation.
Welcome to today's episode of the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Town Meeting for Saturday, April 8th. And what you've just heard is Helga Zepp-LaRouche speaking about the upcoming Schiller Institute conference, which is entitled, "Without the Development of All Nations, There Can Be No Lasting Peace on the Planet." This conference will be happening 1 week from today. It starts at 9 a.m. It is comprised of 5 panels altogether, 4 of them being discussions, and the 5th being a concert on Sunday evening. We'll be saying more about this conference as we go on, but we just want to give a sense of what the theme of this conference is, or the concept of the conference. In order to do that, we just really refer to a document written by Lyndon LaRouche 40 years ago, 1983. And that document had the following passage, which sort of gives you an idea of what we want to see happen in the course of the deliberations of the next week and subsequently. LaRouche said, "Republican statecraft since Dante Alighieri has viewed the purpose of language to be the empowering of a people to impart and receive, in the words of poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, in defense of poetry, profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. A democratic republic cannot long survive unless most members of the nation's electorate, as well as its statesmen and other policy influentials, share a common use of a literate language developed to communicate profound and scientifically rigorous thought respecting the consequences of choices of public policy. Until such a condition of the general electorate is achieved, every republic continues to be threatened from within by the danger that the irrational passions of an underdeveloped popular majority might wreck those institutions of government and policy on which the progress and survival of that nation depends." And so the idea of the deliberations, which we are asking people to participate in, which are unavailable to the general American or other citizens of the world, involve the opportunity to hear from and to discuss with persons who are former heads of state, some people, former people involved in the Congress, intelligence officers and former intelligence officers. But beyond those people, organizers from around the world, trade unionists, other people who have done things in life that are very, very important and come together as a single unit for the purpose of trying to figure out in what way can those of us who are still, in the case of the transatlantic world, rational, seize control from the lunatics in the asylum who have usurped through various forms of marches through the institutions over the course of the past half century, have usurped the kind of the levers of power. They are not actually powerful because they know very little and have failed in every policy format that has been available to them. But the problem is, with that said, they have deeply impacted in an injurious way the rest of the world. And much of the rest of the world is now prepared to walk away from that. But the problem is that those who are committing the mistakes in the transatlantic world are not prepared to let the rest of the world walk away, and will provoke and will even carry out thermonuclear war if they believe that their actual, if you will, conceptual, emotional livelihood is at stake. We've reached a point where the dictates of Wall Street and the City of London are now identified as the national interests of the United States and of various nations in the transatlantic world. And when you've reached that point, then you no longer have the moral fitness to survive in the countries that purport to say things like that. There's a completely different notion of humanity, which is associated with that kind of predatory outlook than is proper and appropriate for the human race, not human. And the conceptions of economics as practiced in the transatlantic world for the past half century represent a bestial, that is a Malthusian conception that has to be thoroughly overturned. Now, Harley Schlanger, who normally is actually with us each week, interviewed Helga Zepp-LaRouche a couple of days ago, where she further elaborated on the theme of this conference. We're going to play that for you now.
Well, it's interesting, Helga. A number of the questions that have come in are about how to organize this, what we can do to get more people, not just to the conference, but organizing for the conference. Let's start with one from Thomas, who said, well, it appears that the unipolar order is gone. The financial crisis is escalating. What will it take, though, to recognize that the proposals coming from Russia, China, and the global South are in the national interests of Western countries?
Well, they are in the interest of the Western countries, you know. I mean, look, Russia has just put out a new foreign policy doctrine. which, I read. It's a longer paper, and, it is mostly defensive and a reaction to what Russia perceives as a policy of increasing containment. But it also is, reasserting the position of Russia as a global player, rejecting the idea that what Obama had said at the time, that Russia is just a regional player. But despite a sharpened tone, without any question, it does have a whole paragraph or several paragraphs where it says the door is still open. That if the West would agree to treat Russia on an equal level, then, Russia would be open to reopen negotiations and cooperation with the West on an equal footing. Now, that is not yet a sense of trust and going back to older periods of cooperation, but the door is open. And, I think that demonization of Russia, which has occurred in the recent period, for example, in places like Germany, where, if you even say that Russia has, a right to exist, I mean, you're already ostracized as a Putin understander. I mean, this is absolutely insane what is going on in Germany right now. Fortunately, there are more and more people, who do not agree. For example, there is a new appeal by the son of Willy Brandt, Peter Brandt, basically, demanding ceasefire and negotiations. But, I think there has to be a stop. And, I think a model is the Peace of Westphalia, because the Peace of Westphalia ended 150 years of religious war in Europe. And the reason why the warring parties came to the negotiation table was because they recognized that nobody would be left to enjoy victory because everybody would be dead. Because at that time, 1/3 of Europe was already destroyed in terms of people, villages, cattle. So then for 4 years, they sat on the negotiation table and worked out principles, which were the basis for international law. So I think that is what has to occur. And one of the principles was that for the sake of peace, one has to take into account the interest of the other. Now that is today what we are trying to put on the table with the international security and development architecture, which has to take into account the interest of every other, of Ukraine, of Russia, of China, of North Korea, of Iran, of Venezuela, of all the others. They cannot be left out of the new design. And the other principle coming from the Peace of Westphalia was that for the sake of peace, one has to forget and forgive the crimes committed by one or the other side. I mean, I have no way of knowing all these reports coming from Ukraine. And, if you have war, then atrocities happen. In general, I don't think that the majority of what is being said is truthful, because we are living in a period of black propaganda, gray propaganda. If I listen to Deutschlandfunk, which I do every day just to watch what they are saying, but there's not one truthful news anymore, which doesn't have a spin. And I can judge and prove some of these news because I know what is being said and what they are saying. So how do I know what they are saying about what happens in Ukraine? But even if, some crimes were committed by one or the other side, there has to be a stop, because the escalation is World War III and nobody would be left to survive that. So I think what needs to be done is we have to have a new international financial system, because the present one is hopelessly bankrupt. And if you just look at the rate with which people are getting out of the dollar, selling US treasuries, for example, Brazil has sold in the year of 22 10% of its US treasuries. China, I think 170 something billion selling U.S. treasuries. But even Japan sold more than 180 billion U.S. treasuries in the last year. And that should show clearly that, this is not just the BRICS doing that, but a general recognition that there is something fundamentally wrong with this present casino economy. Because the U.S. basically has been printing money and, while other countries like China have been going out of speculation, forbidding speculation. And if you look at the derivative exposure of Chinese banks, it's a tiny percentage. Goldman Sachs, for example, has a derivative to capital asset exposure of 99-1. So this is a bubble, and the everything bubble is about to blow. So what is needed is an orderly reorganization of the system. What Franklin D. Roosevelt did with the Glass-Steagall Banking Separation Act in 1933, with the New Deal, with putting the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a credit mechanism, which was replicated by the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in Germany in the post-war period. So there are reference points. We're not talking about inventing the wheel. We are talking about going back to a system of economy which did function, and all this deregulation and all this going into pure money making, maximizing the speculation profit for a few, that has to stop. And I think, if there would be a serious sign coming from the West, which would have to be credible, and there's a big gap right now after what Merkel and Hollande admitted in respect to their cheating on the Minsk process. So there has to be a credible statement. But, I think that would be the only way. And that's what we have to organize for.
Helga Zepp-LaRouche, some months ago, initiated a process of dialogue with people all over the world by writing a document called The 10 Principles of a New International Security and Development Architecture. And this document was intended to outline how a new paradigm in world international relations could be established, including among those who thought of themselves as enemies or adversaries, by subscribing to fundamental principles, which she then submitted as a draft of. And the idea was to begin a discussion process around these principles. One of the people that responded at that time was the person that's speaking to us today, Professor Clifford Kiracofe. He is the president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development, and he has a in-depth sort of knowledge of the workings, also the inner workings of Washington, D.C. We sort of tentatively entitled his presentation for today, "To End Perpetual War, Return to the Anti-Imperial Origins of American Foreign Policy." We're happy to have him with us today. Cliff, how are you? Doing okay?
Doing great. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're doing fine. Great. We can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. Things are fine at this end. Spring is here. We've got a rebirth, I guess you could say, a new season taking place, and which is interesting for us, also for the conference in April. We're starting a whole new cycle now, a spring cycle. Basically, Dennis and I were talking about the state of our republic a few weeks ago, and the problems of foreign affairs and internal affairs, etc. And one of the things we discussed was, how do we recover our better traditions? How do we rejuvenate our republic and have a kind of a rebirth of the nation? Get us out of the mess we're in right now, that we've fallen into. So one of the first thoughts we had was, let's discuss the Roman Republic and as a republic, and then think about our own republic in its founding period. And then we can talk a little bit, I'll talk a little bit today about our international relations, our foreign relations as a young republic around the world, and stressing commerce and friendship. And the treaties back in that day and age were called treaties of friendship and commerce. And that picks up the mutual advantage concept that is traditional in diplomacy, in this type of diplomacy, and the mutual advantage, advantage of the other, advantage of both sides that Helga just mentioned. So to start, I'm just going to make some remarks and we can have questions later. It's not a formal lecture, it's just some thoughts and remarks that derived from the discussion Dennis and I had a couple of weeks back on the Roman Republic. First, let's take a look at the context from, say, 200 BC or BCE, before Common Era, down to 44 BC when Julius Caesar became the dictator. From about 200 BC down to that era of Caesar, the Roman Republic entered into a period of constant external warfare, constant wars for 200 years, off and on, but still constant. That reminds us a little bit today of the United States. In my own lifetime, we've been at war most of my lifetime. In the 1950s in Korea, then we had the Vietnam War that we all opposed. Then we got ourselves into Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years there. So the United States has been in a constant state of war since World War II, since the 1950s. From about 100 BCE to 44 BCE, when Julius Caesar became the dictator, there were a number of factors that disturbed the democracy that the Republic had and its traditions. First, there was because of the wars and such, there was a massive immigration of non-Romans who had served as soldiers for the imperial wars of this republic. And this massive immigration of non-Romans changed the culture in Rome of the Roman Republic and impaired its democratic ethos. Another point to take a look at is the traditional Roman religion, which was very patriotic, became displaced by Oriental cults like the cult of Mithra or the cult of Isis, sort of these new ideologies. And we can think today in the United States, in our republic, of the cult of wokeness that's everywhere. It's pervasive, the cult of wokeness, which really started with the Frankfurt School in Germany and critical theory and all that, and came to the United States in the 1930s. So we've had this in our university systems, penetrating slowly, and K through 12 as well. So the United States has this sort of ISIS cult or Mithra cult coming in, and it's the cult of wokeness. So it's ideological issues. The third aspect, or another aspect of the problems in the Roman Republic, were the increasing militarization of the Republic itself and the rise of generals taking over for periods of time. So this militarization of society and government impaired, or even you could say broke up, the constitutional basis of the Republic, the traditional constitutional basis of the Republic. We had General Marius seize power in 88 BCE, followed by General Sulla a few years later in 82 BCE, becoming the dictator. So from the 80s BCE in the Roman Republic, we start to see these military stepping in and military dictatorships stepping in. That can kind of remind us today of our military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address back a long time ago, half century ago. So this process of militarization of the American republic and people is similar to that, what happened to impair the workings of the Roman Republic. So let's shift over to the US Republic. As we know, we had our War of Independence in 1776, etc. And in 1783, we had a peace treaty with Great Britain, the Peace of Paris. And that really established us on the map as in diplomacy, as an independent country, and operating in Europe, etc., with normal diplomatic relations. After the Treaty of Paris, the United States, now being independent country, had won in victory in the war. We needed to get our economy going, and we needed to get our foreign commerce going, our foreign trade. Obviously, we have products that we'd like to sell to foreign countries, foreign merchants in foreign countries, and we have products from foreign countries that we'd like to import. So basically commerce. And of course, with commerce, trade, also comes relationships with foreign cultures. You obviously, in that day and age, you had to sail abroad and sail into the port and meet with the local merchants and learn a little bit about the local culture and be respectful. And also, Americans were very interested in all these foreign cultures, which I'll get into. So shortly after we got our independence and began our commercial explorations of the world, we come to 1784, just a year after the peace treaty I mentioned, and we sent a ship called the Empress of China out to China to see if we could establish some trade with China. And that ship left from New York City Harbor on George Washington's birthday, February 22nd. And actually, a lot of the crew, captain and crew, were members of the Society of Cincinnati, which was a patriotic organization of military officers from the Revolutionary War. So here we are, 1784, sailing on out to China to see if we could strike some business deals out there that were mutually advantageous. We established our base of operation in China, where we were permitted, where foreigners were permitted to be. And so we established our presence in Canton. Today it's called Guangzhou in their language, but we say Canton. You'll see in this very famous picture, you'll see a bunch of flags. The American flag is in the middle of this particular picture, and behind them are buildings. And on the lower floor of the buildings are the warehouses, and the merchants from the various countries would live on the upper floors. And of course, the movement would be restricted. You couldn't wander all around China. You had to stay in this port. But that's a real fun picture, I think, that kind of shows back in the 1780s, 1790s and all that, not only was the United States out there, but many other countries were trying to trade with China in Canton. And you can see that on a map. We have Macau and Canton on a map. Maybe it's a little difficult to see there, but at home you can Google it and look it up. But Macau, and then north of Macau, sailing up north, you hit Canton or Guangzhou. Also, a little bit to the right of Macau on that map, you'll see Hong Kong. So you've got an interesting trade pattern there, going way back. And we also, our merchants not only sailed in and sailed out, a number of our merchants actually lived in Canton and Macau, kind of permanently, or for a few years while they were trading. how did we do that? Well, we befriended a Chinese merchant who we called Hao Kwa. It was kind of a nickname that we gave to him. His name was, in Chinese, it's Wu Bingjiang. There's a picture of him, said to be the wealthiest man in the world at the time. But he was the head of the Chinese Merchant Society, Hong merchants. So he was kind of, you could say, the head of their Chamber of Commerce in modern terms. And he befriended Americans. We were obviously competing with the British and, and others. And he befriended Americans and American merchants. And it was really because of Hao Kwa, Wu Bingjiang, that we were able to successfully establish commercial relations with China in that early period. So he was a really important person and a true friend of the United States and also of the merchants. He protected our merchants and helped them if they had difficulties, financial difficulties or other types of difficulties. He would straighten things out. So again, you have this early friendship with the merchants in Canton and Macau, early friendship with the Chinese. We were very interested in Chinese culture. The merchants were amazed by the beautiful china and the silks, and the painting of him was a famous painting you just saw. And the merchants would also then sell those Chinese products back in New England in particular. And you'll see in some of the old villages in New England and some of the museums, you will see some of the old china or silk or memorabilia from that era of the early China trade. So it was a very fundamental engagement with China, not just mere commerce and doing business, but also culturally. We were very interested in Chinese people, Chinese culture, the Confucian philosophy, the fantastic art that China had over the centuries. So there was this cultural interchange as well. And that's a very important point. Moving on to India, back in that day and age in the 1780s, 1790s, naturally we wanted to trade with India. And thus we sailed out of New England, of course, through the South Atlantic, over into the Indian Ocean. And we sailed around India to places that would receive us. And there were two main ports that we sailed to, Madras, and that is called the city of Chennai today. But back in the old days, it was called Madras. And also, we traded with, on the eastern coast there, in the southern tip of India, a French settlement called Pondicherry. I mean, there wasn't one whole India back in that day and age. There were different little, you could say, kingdoms or maharajas that were, it wasn't a unified place. So the French had trading post in Pondicherry, and American merchants were very welcome to come there and do some trading, work with the French, work with the local people, et cetera, et cetera. So here again, now we can see we are developing a cultural interest in India, their art, their architecture, their philosophies, etc. So this is, again, part of the commerce, trade, economics, but also an interest in the culture. Next up, we can come into the Mediterranean area and North Africa area. And here, to preface that, Morocco, the country of Morocco, the ruler there, recognized a ship flag of an American ship in his port in Rabat in 1777. And this ruler, he was called a sultan or a king, Muhammad III. This the sultan was the first foreign government to recognize officially the American flag vessel. This was the first year into our War of Independence, 1776. Now it's 1777, and no one really knows what's going on. You know, the Americans are patriots are fighting the British Empire, etc. But he recognizes the American flag and permits American ships to trade in his port. And later on, actually, President George Washington had an exchange of letters with the Sultan. That's an interesting historical point. When I worked in the United States Senate back in the 1980s for over a decade, in our Senate Foreign Affairs, Foreign Relations Committee room in the Capitol building, back in that day, we had a little copy of the letter from George Washington to the Sultan, and then a copy translated from the Sultan back to George Washington. So it was one of the only pieces of art, actually, in that in the room. So you could say Morocco is really our oldest friend in terms of recognizing us as a newly independent republic struggling to secure its independence through war. Our commerce expanded in the Mediterranean basin. Naturally, we were trading with the northern part of the basin, Spain, France, Italy, but we continued trading with the Islamic countries, Arab countries on the southern coastline there. And I do want to make a point. The Sultan of Morocco, in their tradition, is a descendant of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him. And so the first country to recognize the American flag was an Islamic country, ruled by traditionally the descendant of Muhammad himself. I think that's very interesting. We'll come back to that maybe in the discussion about U.S. and Middle East relations these days. But the second country we engaged in the southern Mediterranean was the country of Tunisia. Tunisia, it's a beautiful little country. I've been there. I've been to Morocco too and lectured there. Morocco's a lovely little country. And the ruler there was friendly to us. And we could then trade with his country. And a very important point I would like to make, in the Treaty of Friendship and Commerce with Tunisia, you have a Christian power, so-called, the United States, signing a treaty with a Muslim country. And no problem. And the first three words of that treaty, and you could look it up if you'd like somewhere, the first three words of the treaty between the United States and Tunisia are, God is infinite. American side says, yep. The Tunisian Islamic side says, yep, we can agree on that. And then we go forward into the treaty. So here again, there's no problems between the United States and the Islamic world. I mean, true, there were the Barbary pirates episode, but they were put up to a lot of their piracy by the British Empire to harass us in the Med. But that's a separate story. At any rate, we were developing good relations with Islamic countries, Islamic rulers. And their culture was very interesting to us. The next country that we developed relations with is today called Libya. Back then it was the trading center was called Tripoli. So if you look on a map, you'll see Tripoli is part of Libya. And then following that, a bit further to the east, we established relations with Egypt. And additionally, we established relations with Turkey. And the city of Smyrna in Turkey, as it used to be called, and now it's called Izmir. And so we had nice relations culturally and economically with the Ottoman Empire. Back in that day, it was ruled by Ottoman Sultan or king. And also Egypt was ruled in a similar way. So that takes care of the Mediterranean and North Africa. Our early engagement with Islamic people in that basin. I'll come to the Persian Gulf a little later. So just to recap, we've been in the Mediterranean and North Africa. We've been out to China. We've been out to India. And all of this is in the 1780s, 1790s. What about the Persian Gulf? Well, our merchants in New England and New York and Philly sailed out of those ports across the southern Atlantic, around Africa, and then, logically, wanted to trade up the eastern coastline of Africa. And one place that a lot of trade was done was the island of Zanzibar. And so American ships would go to that port and trade for different goods. This is not the slave trade. These are goods trade. And there'd be merchants from other countries there, and our merchants were there. The island of Zanzibar, back in the 1800s, let's say, early 1800s, when we were out there, was ruled by the ruler of Oman. If you take a look at the map of the Persian Gulf, you'll see that in the green area there is Arabia, now Saudi Arabia, and their Gulf states and all. But Oman is on the up on the right-hand side, right at the tip of the right-hand side there, on the green, the lower right. And exactly. And you have the Gulf of Oman, and you see a little town called Muscat, M-U-S-C-A-T. That is today the capital of the country that is called Oman. And our merchants were very active out of Muscat. Our ships were up there, and the ruler there was extremely friendly to Americans. And interestingly, the present ruler of Oman is a descendant of the ruler who was friendly to us way back in the 1820s. An important strategic point in World War II, we being friends of Oman, we could fly missions and base ourselves in some ways in Oman with regard to the Indian Ocean.
I believe we're having a technical problem. We'll try to get Cliff back on. And let me just do the following, bring up, well, let me also first of all say, if you've just joined us or have joined us in the last moments, we want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Town meeting of the LaRouche organization. Today, we're devoting to a discussion which is of the 10 principles for a new strategic, new international security and development architecture of Helga Zepp-LaRouche. That was Dr. Clifford Kiracofe you were just hearing, who is the president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. And what he's doing is establishing a case unknown to most Americans of the role of the true American foreign policy, the anti-imperial foreign policy that the United States pursued explicitly against the imperial policy of Great Britain during the 1770s and 1780s. And so we want to do that. We also want to point out that there will be, and we'll come to this in just a minute, the Schiller Institute will be doing a conference in which themes of this type will be discussed, particularly in panel 4 of the conference, although all of the panels will relate to these matters. And the conference is called "Without the Development of All Nations, There Can Be No Lasting Peace for the Planet." And so it's going to be a 4-panel conference starting on Saturday, 9 o'clock in the morning, first panel from 9 to noon, and then the second panel from 1 to 4. There are 2 panels on Saturday, and then there are also 2 panels on Sunday, along with a concert which will be happening in the evening. Also, I guess at this point, maybe what we ought to do is bring up the panel that we have, just so I've got them up there. He's back? Okay, fine. Are you able to hear us,
No,
Cliff?
I had just a little. Yes, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, now you're back and we hear you clearly.
Okay, good. Yeah, it was just some electronic interruption of some kind on the internet. Where I left off, and I'll finish fairly quickly now. I'd left off summarizing where we've been on the map, and I was talking about the Persian Gulf and the little trading port of Muscat, and the ruler there of what is today called Oman, the country of Oman. Now, an interesting point there is that when our ships, this is the 1830s, 1820s, 30s, 40s, back in that era, when our ships were in Muscat, if you look at the map, just across north of Muscat, kind of northwest a little bit, across the Persian Gulf is Persia, or what we would call today Iran. And so we had then early encounters with people in Iran, Persian people, and we had established trading relations with the people in Persia, also Muslim, and we were very interested in their culture as well. So we had commercial business, and also we had interesting culture. We were learning about the world. We were learning about different cultures, etc. I believe there might have been a little trade up, also up the coastline to what is today called United Arab Emirates. We may have had some ships that have went up into that area as well in the Persian Gulf. But the main thing here was we had nice relations with Iran. The last two places I want to mention, we're going to shift and go over to Indonesia in the Pacific. And back in that day, there were the Spice Islands out there, nutmeg and different spices, pepper. And there were a group of islands called the Moluccas. And our ships would sail out there. Our clipper ships, etc., would sail out there to trade so we could get some spices, pepper, nutmeg, as I mentioned, and other spices, and other types of products. And then we would trade and they would get some of our products. So here we had early established relations then again in the late 1790s, early 1800s. We had these relations with what is today called Indonesia. And of course, that has quite an interesting cultural background to it as well. So we were interested in the Indonesian cultures that we encountered there. A little later in the 1840s, in that same area, we went up to Siam, which today is called Thailand, and we were trading in Siam. We can see on the map, today we would call that Southeast Asia, but you'll see Siam there. And as we say today, it's Thailand. And by the 1850s, we had tried a little earlier, but it didn't work out. By the 1850s, we were able to open relations with Japan. Maybe we did a little elbowing and strong arming there, but we opened up trade relations with Japan, which were very good for both sides. And we were exposed to Japanese culture, art, architecture, things along those lines. And actually that had quite an influence. Japanese art and culture had quite an influence in the United States in the late 1800s, 1890s, Chicago World's Fair and things like that. There was a Japanese pavilion. And so Americans had a very positive relationship and thoughts for Japan. Unfortunately, in the 1920s, the Japanese militarists took over, and obviously that led to Pearl Harbor. But in the early days, we had very positive and decent relations with the Japanese, and they had an impact on our culture as well. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of America as it used to be. Some of our better traditions America as it used to be. Anti-imperialistic, we fought the British Empire and won. I will add that the British still thought they could nail us, and that started the War of 1812. And we concluded that war in 1815 successfully. And so you could say the War of 1812 to 1815 was the real nailing down of our independence. That was decisive. Of course, then the British worked to foment the Civil War and break us up again, but that's a whole different lecture and story. The main point I wanted to make today in my talk, and we can have questions, is that the United States, Americans, our tradition was peaceful commerce, friendship with foreign countries. You can see that in George Washington's farewell address, which is very important for everyone to read these days. So that's the old kind of tradition and culture of the United States and Americans. Now contrast that in your mind to what's going on today in Washington, D.C., which is something of a horror show. Everybody wants to make war in the Middle East, right? Iraq and Afghanistan, and now let's go to war with Iran. Oh, those bad Iran people, and what about Taiwan? Let's go to war with China because of Taiwan. We want some war, And how do we account for the psychology in Washington, D.C. today, and compare and contrast American culture, American foreign policy, the quality of leadership in Washington, in the White House, in Congress, the scandalous behavior of the media, lying to us every day of the week about everything, our hysteria about Russia, our bizarre support of the Nazi regime in Ukraine. When you contrast what we're doing today with how we used to be, it kind of gets you more than a little irritated at the present political establishment. And I would just say that the direction we're headed in now is a dead end, and we're going to crash and burn unless we change our ways and try to recover some of our traditions, our openness that we had in our early republic days, and recover sort of the spirit of George Washington's farewell address, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton, all the founding fathers wanting to have good relations around the world, not to have any wars, and to oppose imperialism, like the Monroe Doctrine did. So I'll conclude there and look forward to any questions you have, and hope you learned a little something.
Oh, I'm sure there are going to be questions, Cliff. Thank you very much for your presentation. We've got a panel of distinguished questioners, which are here with us, and
Great.
I'm going to introduce them, and then let you know that there's already a good deal of flurry of activity in the chat room about what you've said.
All right.
So we have, yeah. So there's Isa Martinez, hello, and we got Cade Levinson, and we have the infamous Kynan Thistlethwaite, who has been making life
Oh, there's
difficult.
Kynan. Okay.
Yes. So here's what we'll do. Rather than me go to the, I'll just indicate that you've created a certain amount of controversy, and I'll let it go at the moment at that, and just see what our panelists have to say. So let me start with Kynan, and then we'll go to you, Isa, and then you, Kate.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that, Cliff. I think that clears up a lot of assumptions that people might have about the historical United States. And it certainly clears a lot up for me, because in school, what I remember about this period that you were talking about, they teach you about the Monroe Doctrine. They'll talk about Jackson's presidency in the Trail of Tears. So you get an image of a of an imperialist United States. And I think what you presenting totally contradicts that, and it's something that's not taught in school, and other centers of education around the nation. And you can see, I mean, as you pointed out, it totally contrasts with our policy today. What with the endless wars that we fought all around around the world, Iraq, Libya, Syria, the list goes on. And it's represented in our foreign policy establishment with these people like Blinken, Samantha Power, that do not represent the true anti-imperialist foreign policy of our nation. So I think my question is, when did this turn start? When did our anti-imperial foreign policy, when did that change historically? I remember, because we talked about, Teddy Roosevelt, the big stick policy, and the 1890s kind of reflecting a change, with McKinley being assassinated to, Roosevelt then becoming president. So if you could comment on that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, Conan, I think you hit the nail on the head with the 1890s. And to put a little finer touch on that, 1898, the war with Spain, completely unnecessary. Remember, McKinley was assassinated, etc. But the war with Spain. And what did we do? Well, we grabbed Cuba, we grabbed Puerto Rico, and we grabbed the Philippines. Now, my goodness, talk about imperialism. So, and that actually created quite a stir politically in the United States. Now, that war was run by the Republican Party. In 1900, for the election, presidential election in 1900, you can read the Democratic Party platform, which opposed imperialism. And so in the United States, there was a debate, and you can look it up, but there was quite a debate even among Republicans, because one of the factions of the Republican Party was very anti-imperial. So and different factions in the Democratic Party may have supported the imperialism. So you can kind of go back and sort that out. But usually this type of historical topics. I used to teach American history, but I also taught diplomatic history, U.S. diplomatic history. And actually, one of the first things I studied at the University of Virginia with a very famous professor, Norman Gravener, who passed away. But he was one of the most famous professors of American diplomatic history. And if you're interested in American diplomatic history, I would recommend the writings of Professor Bemis, B-E-M-I-S, Samuel Flagg Bemis, B-E-M-I-S. He taught at Yale University, and he was kind of the grand old professor of American diplomatic history. And his books are this thick, and he's little books too. He has a very interesting book on the diplomacy of the American Revolution, which is extremely useful little book. But Bemis, I think, is one of the best guides. It's the old school. It's old traditional school, old school. So I would say the imperialism starts with this war against Spain in 1898. And who's leading that? Well, New York, the Wall Street bankers. Because as we know from various theories of imperialism, we have the British Professor Hobson, Hobson. Professor Hobson wrote a book called Imperialism, where he develops an entire theory of imperialism. He wrote several other books as well, but that he's well known for. He was a British professor. He was against imperialism. And his books became very popular in some American academic circles. He wrote in the early 1900, 1905, back in there. And so some of our early professors of international relations and history, European history, used Professor Hobson's Anti-Imperialism book as a real strong reference. Other theoreticians who were anti-imperialist, naturally we think of Vladimir Lenin, the communist leader. He wrote a book on imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism. We can think of some European economists, German economist Hilferding of Austria, and a few others that were writing about imperialism. So this imperialism began, of course, very early on, in the late 1400s and early 1500s, when Portugal, the Portuguese and the Spanish colonialism and all that stuff. But in the modern era, say in the 1900s, it was toward the 1870s, 1880s, the so-called scramble for Africa and all. And at this time, you had ideologies like the sort of proto-fascist German philosopher Nietzsche, Superman, and the British Spencer and Darwin, Survival of the Fittest. And so you had these ideologies floating around, notorious ideologies floating around Europe in the late 19th century, inspiring the Europeans and merging with the already existent militarism in Europe. So then you start to see in the late 1880s, 90s, a little bit before, the French Empire, British Empire, which had been around a while, both of them, the German Empire, Russian Empire, all these national imperialisms, all trying to grab pieces of land over in Africa or out in Asia or wherever. So this was the world that we in the United States were living in. And then all of a sudden, in 1898, after having been anti-imperialist, we succumbed to the British example, I guess you could say, of imperialism, and ran that Spanish-American War. The Philippines became independent much later, after World War II. We let Cuba go after about 3 years, and we still hold on to Puerto Rico, which I think, maybe they should be independent. Maybe they would prefer to be independent. I hope that answers some of your question. It's a complicated question. We could talk about it for a long time.
Let me do the following, Cliff, because I think, several things that you just raised there, I need to say something about this. Well, first of all, because of some of the questions that are coming in, and also just because of the nature of the format of what we're doing about this last business. This is one of the reasons, and fact, just to indicate to people, and I'll give the background on this in a moment, Lyndon LaRouche wrote several documents during the year 1983, 40 years ago exactly. We've talked about some of them in the recent days, such as Saudi Arabia in the year 2023, which he wrote 40 years ago and has an extended program that applies to Southwest Asia and the Arabian Peninsula right now. This is another example of the same thing. This was written in 1983, and you see it's called the Design for a Leibnizian Academy of Morocco. Now, Lynn was very aware of the early history of the United States and was involved during the year 1983, as he had been actually somewhat earlier, in writing a set of policy papers that were addressing every sector of the world, whether that was South America in the form of his Operation Juarez, whether that was Africa in the form of a document he wrote back in 1981-82 called Critical Comments Appended to the Lagos Plan of Action. It was a response to a extended plan that had been presented in Nigeria for economic development, or whether it was Saudi Arabia in the year 2023, as I've already shown. He even wrote at one point a constitution for the Republic of Iran. He did a draft constitution for the Commonwealth of Canada. And all these things were done during 81, 82, 83 in that period, because what he was trying to do was to define for people his administration's approach to foreign policy, that largely coming from the successful campaign that he waged with President Ronald Reagan to adopt the Strategic Defense Initiative. And one of the big problems of today is, as people are aware, but they're only aware negatively, is that the United States has just spent, in the course of the last 20 years, perhaps as much as $20 trillion altogether, certainly over $10 trillion on war. Admittedly, some $8 trillion in Afghanistan and other monies in, obviously, in Iraq and otherwise. So that while one might argue that it's not really money, on the other hand, the point of the thing is that that orientation was what had been shifted by President Reagan and Lyndon LaRouche 40 years ago with the SDI. The idea was to deploy the wealth of the nation in advanced technological progress and to have allies that join the nation in that context. There's a phrase or a section that I don't have, I think, actually it may be, I just want to refer to this. I believe it's in this document, and if not, just occurred to me, in which Lynn talks about the problem of historiography, and he talks about the urgent need to correct the idea and the problem of British involvement in the definitions of historiography. And if I don't have it now, I'll refer to it in a moment. Now, the reason I bring this up is what you just went through, and part of what you're talking about. One has to look at the impact on the United States of the Specie Resumption Act of the 1870s, and how the United States went from its triumphant unity, unification of the country, in what was often called the 1861 to 65 war, mistakenly called the Civil War. You can call it by a lot of names. You could call it the War of Southern Aggression. You could call it, or you could more importantly call it the War of French and British Imperial attack on the United States. That's what you could call it, using the Confederacy for that purpose. So we got one question, which I'll put in here, so you see what kind of controversy has been stirred up, and it'll be useful for for the people on the panel. We'll come back to you guys. There's a question from Ahmed, and Ahmed is actually from Northern Africa. I'm not going to say exactly where, but one of the countries you've mentioned. And he says, Dr. Kirakofe, Halkwa is perhaps not a good example of anti-imperialism. Anton Chaikin documented his deep involvement with the Boston Brahmin opium traders, such as the Perkins and Forbes. What do you think? And I think there'll be some interesting. There's other questions like that you're about to get. So let's do a little bit of that, so that the panelists can also be, shall we say, made aware of what's going on in the chat room.
Sure. Yeah, he was also Russell and Company handled his descendants' estate, his estate for his descendants. All the merchants, he was the head of the Chamber of Commerce there, so he dealt with all of the U.S. merchants that were doing business out there. And he basically helped protect some of us from the British influence out there. It's very technical history. There have been some books written in recent years about the American community in Macau during that era, and Canton, the trade, the old China trade. So he, as the head of the Chamber of Commerce, he had to navigate, and Russell and Company were out there. But Russell, those opium trade, there were two types of opium traders out there, if you really get into it deeply. And I know Tony's a great historian. There was one group of American opium traders who were aligned with the British, the ones you just mentioned, Russell and Company, and that gets you into Skull and Bones and all of that at Yale, but that's a whole different discussion. And some of the other, and those American merchants, opium merchants, were doing business to link to the British opium merchants, Jardine Matheson and some of those other characters that were out there. So there was that faction of American merchants. There was another faction of American merchants, however, who were not pro-British. They were kind of anti-British, and the British tried to suppress them, and the American pro-British guys were competing against them too. Now, to be truthful, some of the opium trade that Americans were conducting, the anti-British Americans were not allowed to get into the Indian opium trade out of Bengal, because that was unique to the British and their American buddies. So the anti-British American traders, opium traders, sailed out of Smyrna in Turkey, today Izmir. Now, obviously the opium trade is immoral, but I'm just giving you some of the facts of the situation. So the Smyrna trade, then the Smyrna opium trade, that was through Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, because American merchants couldn't get into Bengal. But yeah, that's all very interesting. The most interesting thing to pull out of that is Russell and Company. Russell and Company were the forefathers of the Skull and Bones organization at Yale University, and that gets you into a whole lot of things.
Yes. Okay. Well, as they say, it is what it is, and that's the whole point of this discussion. So, Isa, why don't you please go ahead?
Well, thanks so much for this discussion. I really appreciated your presentation.
Oh, I can't hear the sound.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, we can hear you. Cliff, are you unable to hear her?
Yeah, I cannot hear her.
But you can hear me.
And I can hear Kynan.
Let's do a little test just for a moment. Cade, why don't you say a few things, and let's make sure Cliff can hear you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Excited for the continuing discussion.
I can hear you.
Okay, that's very clear. Okay, so let's try Isa again to see what that's all about. Because she's clear to me.
Can I be heard? Hello?
Are you?
Okay, I can hear you now. I can see you and hear you.
There we are.
All right.
Okay, great. I appreciated your presentation and how you highlighted that throughout history, a lot of, or a number of successful republics have been broken up by these like fringe cults. And you mentioned what we're dealing with now is this cult of wokeness, which is absolutely divisive. And I was just wondering your thoughts on how we might turn that around and get back to the republic that we once were, that you mentioned with the peace and friendship treaty with Morocco, how we get back to that place where we can look at people from totally different backgrounds, be it religious, culturally, otherwise, and start a dialogue that, again, you mentioned began with God is infinite, and we were able to have that outlook together. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Oh, thank you very much. That's a fascinating question. I'm really glad you picked up on that. When I was in Tunisia talking with, I was giving a little talk to the Chamber of Commerce there, and I raised the issue. I said, well, our relations go way back, and we had this treaty of friendship and commerce, and the first three words were, God is infinite, and they were all quite interested in that. Some of them, it was quite interesting dialogue we had. Let's talk about wokeness first, and then we can talk about diplomacy second. Wokeness first. Where does wokeness come from? Wokeness comes from what was called the Frankfurt School, and you can wiki that. Frankfurt, Germany, Frankfurt School, a group of philosophers in the 1920s. It started in the 1920s in a little institute, the Frankfurt School Institute. And you had a number of neo-Marxists, and they reformulated Marxism and Freudianism. to create a revolutionary ideology. Why? Class struggle of Marx was kind of old-fashioned way of looking at a revolution, and it hadn't worked. So these intellectual network set about to remodel Marx, and instead of class struggle, you had different oppressed minority groups struggling. So you could have alternate lifestyle people struggling. You could have women struggling against men. This is sort of the Neo-Freudian aspect too. So you can look up, wiki it, and then kind of get into it a little bit. It's called Critical Theory, and it was created by the Frankfurt School. How did it come? Well, let me mention a couple other points. The Frankfurt School in Germany actually was created through the head of the Soviet intelligence police service called the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky, hard to spell, but Felix Dzerzhinsky was the head of the Cheka at the time. Those are the torturers and the murderers and all that kind of stuff. Dzerzhinsky and a Hungarian guy by the name of Gregor Lukács, L-U-K-A-C-S. And it was Lukács went to Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Soviet Cheka, and got backing. And then that, through relations with the German Social Democratic and Communist Party, set up this institute in Frankfurt, Germany. When I was at University of Virginia back in the 60s, we had a huge anti-war movement, 60s and early 70s, huge anti-war movement. And I was active in it. Popular philosophers that hit a lot of the campuses around the United States, Herbert Marcuse, M-A-R-C-U-S-E, was particularly influential. He was a Frankfurt School guy. Horkheimer was another one. There were a group of these people because this institute came from Germany because of the Nazi persecution, because most of them were Jewish. Nazi persecution, they came, well, logically, to the United States. Some went to England and France. But when they came to the United States, they went to Columbia University, which offered them a building. And so the Frankfurt School had a building at Columbia University for their institute. From there, they penetrated particularly the sociology professorships around the United States, particularly sociology. So it was a university penetration, critical theory. And later on, it penetrated into the K through 12 through Dewey and some others. So K through 12, if you go on to the NEA site today, I mean, the K through 12 education is also a lot of critical theory in that. So the wokeness then came to the United States through the Frankfurt School, who advocated this new thing called critical theory, which is sort of a twisted Marxism and a twisted Freudianism. And it's been operational now for almost a century, right? From the 1930s. Now we're in the 2020s, so that's 90 years, right? And every year, you know. And so in the 60s is when it really hit Marcuse. It really kind of came out into the open. And back in that day, it wasn't the same type of wokeness as today. It was political correctness and some other stuff. In the late 1970s, in Washington, D.C. and Washington, there was some of the conservative groups picked up on what they called cultural Marxism. And so you can Google cultural Marxism, but it's the same thing as critical theory. It's all the same thing. The idea of the Frankfurt School was to have a revolutionary force, a revolutionary ideology to bring down Western civilization. Naturally, the Soviet communists would be happy about that. And so Dzerzhinsky, head of the secret police and all that, would be encouraging that. So the idea was to subvert the political system by subverting the culture. That also is a theme in Gramsci, the Italian communist theoretician Antonio Gramsci, same type of theoretical work, i.e., in order to subvert politics, you're going to subvert the culture first, and that'll soften everything up, and then you go after the political structures. So what we're in right now, your question is really a good one. What we're in right now is this sort of really militant wokeness stuff, and unfortunately, it's getting to the point of physical violence. You know, you have Antifa, but other kinds of violent groups that are actually, shooting people here in the United States. So while the wokeness on college campuses may be somewhat nonviolent, it is getting into almost, you could say, somewhat terrorist groups operating in the United States that are woke, so-called. Getting us back to our earlier diplomatic traditions, this involves kind of reversing the cultural problem we have in Washington today, the political cultural problem we have. In recent years, you've had a mixture in our foreign policy dominant elite of three main factors. You have the Cold War militarism. These are just the Cold War hawks that have been around since the late 1940s. Military-industrial complex. You have the neoconservative network, the neocons, which came out of the Truman era, 1946, 7, 8. They were anti-communist and pro-Zionist. So that's the neocon movement. Interestingly, the early founders of the neocon movement in the 1930s were Trotskyists at NYU. If any of you are from New York City, there was a Trotskyist network at NYU, and the early neocon forefathers were members of the Trotskyist movement out of NYU. But anyway, after the end of World War, during World War II, of course, the ruler of Russia was Stalin. And so because these people were Trotskyists, they naturally opposed Stalin. So they could sort of pretend that they were anti-communist, right? But they were really anti-Stalin rather than anti-communist. Anyway, so this neoconservative group of intellectuals arose as a factor, anti-communist and anti-Soviet and pro-Zionist. And that group still is very dominant, and I'll get back to that in a second. And then the third group are the humanitarian interventionists, and that was Tony Blair back in 1979 at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, gave a big speech about how Westphalia was dead. Westphalia is the past. That's not the basis for diplomacy anymore. So this was an attack, a direct attack on the Westphalian conception, which was that countries should have diplomacy and have peaceful relations and cooperative mutual advantage, etc. Blair launched this attack on the Westphalian conception of international relations, and that, of course, the neocons love that, and the Cold War hawks, love that. And so you had, and the third factor that I mentioned, these humanitarian interventionists, that was then nicknamed R2P, the letter R, the number 2, the letter P, responsibility to protect, R2P. And that's the humanitarian interventionist, like you mentioned Samantha Power. That's her ideology. But she lines up with other people who are the neocon group. She's not a neocon. She's a humanitarian interventionist. But she lines up with Dennis Ross and some of the other neocon types. And they all are working in the same direction. For example, slaughtering everybody in Syria by supporting the terrorist organizations in Syria that, of course, ISIS, of course, the United States helped build that. But the United States then, so the humanitarian interventionists aren't humanitarian. They support the terrorists. They continue to support the terrorism going on in Syria that you mentioned, for example. So those are the three kind of currents in contemporary American foreign policy that have been dominant. Let me explain the neocons. It's easy to understand the military-industrial complex because that's just steady. That's just steady through the decades. And I would say if you want to really look at their first major think tank of the military-industrial complex, it's the RAND Corporation, R-A-N-D, RAND, out in California. It was an Air Force operation, but RAND, you can go to their website and find all about their hawkish views. Then the neoconservatives came along in the 1950s and 60s. They circled around a intellectual journal called Commentary. If you can Google Commentary, and you can find Commentary magazine, and that's kind of this hawkish Truman, Zionist type orientation. And the neoconservatives first were in the Truman orbit, that is to say, the Democratic Party. However, when Jimmy Carter was trying to have better relations with Egypt and trying to promote peace in the Middle East with Sadat and Rabin and all these people, President Carter was trying to promote peace in the Middle East, late 70s, 78, 79. At that point, the neocon policy network decided, this isn't going to work because this guy, President Carter, is against what we stand for. And what the neocons stand for ideologically is the ideology of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who, it's complicated, but the Jabotinsky people were very hard right Zionists as opposed to the labor Zionists, and so that's why the neocons love Netanyahu today, et cetera, because Netanyahu's dad was Jabotinsky's secretary. Anyway, it's very complicated. So what the neocons did is they jumped over to the Republican Party and penetrated the Reagan administration, and that's how where they focused mostly was penetrating the Pentagon. So you had that whole neoconservative network in civilian jobs in the Pentagon. And you might have a few over at state, Bolton, but mostly they penetrated the Pentagon. And very hawkish, of course. And then that persisted. They sort of hid themselves during the Clinton administration. And then when George W. Bush, the younger Bush, became president, the neocons were back in their glory, and with their patron Dick Cheney and all that. And the neocons got themselves back into the Republican Party networks. McCain is a good example of a completely neoconized Republican. He's dead now, but Lindsey Graham and some of those others, and Tom Cotton and those guys in the Senate carry on the McCain neocon policies. When I was in the Senate, we nicknamed McCain, what do we call him? I'll think of a nickname we had for him. Oh, we called him the Manchurian Candidate. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but we called McCain the Manchurian Candidate. So at any rate, you have those three groups. And what we need to do today is emphasize what Helga's trying to emphasize, a return to Westphalian principles of foreign policy. And voices, you have voices like Ron Paul on the Republican side. Ron Paul, you got his son Rand Paul. Those are the libertarian type people. You got Tom Massey over in the House. Now you have some other new people in the House on the Republican side, and I'm sure there's a few on the Democratic side too. So what we need to do is to make a case that, as Dennis was saying and as Helga has argued, everything is going to come into a real collapse. So that's going to be chaotic here in the United States when everything does hit the fan. And your generation is going to have to pick up the pick up the pieces. Some of us are getting a little old at the moment, but we need to prepare when everything hits the fan to have a new foreign policy.
Right. Yeah, just make sure we can get Kate in also, and we've got several other questions. So, I mean, the answer was appreciated, but got to let him talk here. Go ahead. See if you can get in here.
Thank you. And what I wanted to ask kind of built off of Issa's question somewhat, in terms of what can be done in the present moment. And especially when you were talking about the sort of shift in the paradigm of relations revolving the United States and foreign commerce post the Revolutionary War and the Paris Peace Treaty and after 1815. I was thinking about how it seems like maybe historically any sort of paradigm shift in international economic relations maybe comes subsequent to a large military conflict. If you think of Bretton Woods after World War II, but then specifically thinking around 1815, you did have Jay's Treaty, the Jay Treaty, in 1796. That a decade or two after the Paris Peace Treaty further established normalized economic relations between the United States and Britain, and seemingly as a model for the rest of international commerce for the United States. And you had the failure then to ratify an extension of that in the early 1900s, which seems to be one of the main lead-ups to the war, or the early 1800s, it seemed one of the lead-ups to the War of 1812. And after the War of 1812 with the Treaty of Ghent, that just brought things back to the status quo relations between U.S. and Britain prior to the War of 1812. And so I'm just wondering if you see any possibility in the present moment to bring something about on the terms of the Jay Treaty, where you could have a shift in economic relations, either between what the United States currently is in invigorating its anti-imperial past in a kind of renegotiation with still the oligarchical imperial elite, or with what China is doing or Russia is doing, attempting to do with what they're putting out as their foreign policy on the international stage. Is there a way you see of bringing the necessary people and representatives to the table on an international scale to have a shift in economic relations prior to a military catastrophe internationally?
Okay, that's a good question, and a technical question. Let's approach it in the following way. The oligarchical system, the so-called transatlantic oligarchical system of finance capitalism, imperialism, and with the London and New York at the core of that, the City of London and the Wall Street, that finance capitalism that, as I mentioned, Hobson and Lenin and Hilferding and others critiqued, is kind of heading for a crash. And you could take a look at Michael Hudson's book, Super Imperialism, which is also a very interesting study, a more modern study than Hobson. So what's happening in the world today is that you have what some people call a bifurcation. That is to say, the dollar system on one side and versus another system on the other side. I think that's a bit stark, but that trend is happening. But in the end, it may be the dollar, a multi-currency system, rather than just the single dollar reserve system. It might be a multi-currency system. And you have the yuan and other currencies in there. What's happening, as you've probably seen in some of the press lately, you have China and Russia promoting new international economic relations. Russia has made a historic shift toward Asia, toward emphasizing the Asian part of Eurasia more than the European side. And that's brought Russia and China into alignment with each other. They may have differences in certain areas, but generally speaking, they're aligned. They're aligned toward creating a new world order. They're aligned toward creating new forms of economic cooperation and also a revised international economic system, monetary system. So from that side, you also have the BRICS group, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, adding to that Iran, adding to that other countries, a list of countries that want to join the BRICS Economic Cooperation Group. You also have the narrow RIC, Russia, India, China group, a narrower group, the RIC, and BRICS, which is expanding. And the role of India is a couple of factions, as usual, in different countries. And India has a pro non-aligned faction, which would work well with Russia and China. But then India also has a legacy, a British Imperial faction, which is today the pro-US faction. So India is a bit more complicated in the Indian situation. One can hope that the more independent-minded Indian elites will make the right decision in terms of aligning more with at least a non-aligned position, if not working more closely in the RIC. So what we see then is the United States, as you mentioned, there's a problem of war looming on the horizon. And but on the other hand, there's intense cooperation now around the world. You just saw how China helped bring Saudi Arabia and Iran back together after a decade or so of being pretty sharp conflict. And that was made possible by some earlier diplomacy by Russia, bringing the two sides together. And then finally, China was able to seal the deal. So now you have a stabilization potential in the Middle East region to try to remove any excuses for the Anglo-Americans to create more war out that way. And you'll notice that the leader of Syria, President Assad, is now becoming more welcome and normalizing with the Arab world, United Arab Emirates and other parts of the Arab world, Middle East region, West Asia, if you want to call it that. And so you have a tremendous effort by Russia and China to promote stabilization in the Middle East, reduce tensions, get some diplomacy going, get some commerce and business going, get that Silk Route, the Belt and Road concept moving in there, and shift to cooperation and development and peace rather than all this conflict. You just saw the Yemen war is being terminated. The Iranian and Saudi, all the actors in the Yemen and the UAE, the actors in the Yemen war now are promoting a peaceful solution as we speak. Right now, they're going to open up the Port of Sana and all that. So that's very positive. So we do see some really positive things occurring with respect to the Middle East. And as you mentioned, China and Russia are trying to calm tensions down there. In the Asia Pacific, we see Indonesia is taking a very nice lead on economic development and peace, also some de-dollarization, etc. And also we see the ASEAN, ASEAN organization out there, always promoting peace and economic development. So those are very positive things that are going on out in the Asia Pacific, with the exception of Taiwan issue. And the Taiwan issue, you mentioned excuses for war. Well, Taiwan is the new excuse for war. We already had Ukraine war going on. Now the hawks and all the people in Washington want to get a war with China over Taiwan. Well, Taiwan's been part of China for 400 years, since the 1660s, if not even more anciently than that, if you go way back. But Taiwan is an island that's part of China, just like Hawaii is an island that's part of the United States. But there are those in Washington who are planning a war against China over Taiwan, using Taiwan as the pretext or the excuse. Of course, we'll lose the war, I would say, but that's another issue. So in answer to your question, there are different new frameworks and forums around the world that are promoting peace through development, and the Belt and Road, the BRICS, the RIC, the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and that's expanding rapidly as well, new members to that. So the Eurasian Development Bank and that project. So we have, I think, some very positive developments that are cutting against this unbridled imperialism launched by the United States and principally Great Britain. We just saw President Macron of France in China, where he was very well received, and they concluded a lot of business and economic agreements. That's quite interesting, given the sort of hostility of the European Union and all toward China. So the French seem to be taking a lead in smoothing over relations with China and peace through development, economic relations. So therefore, in more of an answer to your question, well, the United States needs to return to our original concepts of foreign policy. You can see that in George Washington's farewell address, which I highly recommend you read a few times because it's pretty complicated. But reread George Washington's farewell address and look at the part where he talks about foreign commerce and all of that. And the early founding fathers, you had Alexander Hamilton leading the Annapolis Convention way back, trying to get economic cooperation between the newly liberated states, plus foreign commerce, taking into account foreign commerce. So the foreign commerce, the Jay Treaty is a controversial treaty. There was some earlier economic documents that John Adams had worked out and some others had worked out that are quite interesting. And generally speaking, the concept of freedom of trade, not free trade, which is a British term, freedom of trade. That is to say, freedom of our ships to enter a foreign port to do business. Freedom of trade, not free trade, like the British definition, British capitalist definition. So freedom of trade, which means our ability to sail around and trade with people equally on a most favored nation basis. Actually, that was a very early and revolutionary concept that the Americans, after independence, introduced. So yes, we need to get back to our original concepts of friendship, which means peace. I mean, if you're friendly with the country, you're at peace with the country. So a treaty of peace and friendship, right? Treaty of peace and friendship, treaty of friendship and commerce, all those types of treaties, called by different names, but all those different treaties. And you can find them. If you take a look at the Avalon project at Yale University, AVALON, Avalon, project, Yale University. There's all the documents on American history you need right there in the original text. So that's a very useful website for students and interested citizens. I hope I answered your question. I would say I'm optimistic because of these new frameworks that are coming into being, and the Russian, Chinese, India, Indonesia promoting cooperation, so ASEAN. So I'm optimistic in that sense. And the I don't see a currency war between the dollar and other currencies. What I think we're going to see is just, okay, the dollar's out there, but then other currencies are out there too, the yuan and whatever. So it may not be as stark as a clash, a bifurcation clash between two monetary systems. Hopefully there'll be cooperation but the point you mentioned about war, those hawks in Washington and on Wall Street, logically, they they don't want to see this, so they may try to resort to war in order to prevent this, which is what they're doing in Ukraine, obviously. Right? Ukraine is aimed against Russia. So, but I think I'm optimistic. I think more and more countries realize that what Helga's been talking about is needed. We need some new thinking and new policies.
Okay,
Hope that answered it.
Right, very good. Several other questions. What we're going to do, because there's a lot of questions, and obviously what will be needed, of course, this is very useful for the conference or for people that should understand that the process that we have that will be going on at the conference is the process that you're seeing here. We want to just take the opportunity to say to people that we want you to help organize for the conference, this conference being next Saturday. For 2 days, actually Saturday and Sunday, 2 panels. Without the development of all nations, there can be no lasting peace for the planet. And that's for everybody that's tuned in. What we want people to do is help us both in terms of recruiting other people to participate, but really by doing exactly what we're doing right here, generating other discussions. And obviously, there's several proposals for what might be done. Some of which we're receiving in the chat, some of which I'm getting otherwise on my phone, that we should pursue a more in-depth discussion about American history. For example, one of the kind of genre of query that I'm getting is, how could you even begin to approach studying a topic like this? It seems so vast and it seems so differentiated. So I have one comment which I'd like to read from it's an old thing written by Tony Chaikin at one point. He said, "For my part, around 1979, this is over 40 years ago, I read an atrocious piece in the New York Times celebrating Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton's killer, as a misunderstood romantic rebel. Wondering why the New York establishment would side against such a pillar of the nation as Hamilton, I began reading the original sources, the works of Hamilton and other pro-Republican historical leaders. I found that the historiography in our era did not simply misplace these historical figures on the political spectrum, but that the philosophical political mental map of these former leaders was several orders of magnitude more profound and more pro-human than anything in the mental map of our era's available politics. There is a legacy and a tradition of republicanism and Republican leadership in science, art, and statecraft from Greece and Egypt, and revived and expanded later, which has always been responsible for human progress." So that's the way that Tony approached how he started to do and to discover what he needed to know. Go read the people that you are talking about or that you're critiquing. Don't read about them. It's also a piece of advice that Lyndon LaRouche gave me the very first time I met him in December of 1970. It's a while ago. And I began quoting to him from various books like Isaiah Berlin's book on Karl Marx. And he said, whoa, stop. If you're going to talk to me about Marx, have you read Marx? Don't talk to me about Hegel. Have you read Hegel? You got to read these people. Don't read what people say about these people. Now, half a century later, those of us who have been on the receiving end of what people say about us, trying to explain continually why we aren't what people talk about that they say we are, understand why LaRouche said that. And so for those people both in the chat room and otherwise blowing up my phone or asking about that, I just would point out, okay, yes, we can do this with you. And we are very happy to, introduce you to the original real people of actual American history, whether we're talking about, people like John Jay, who was one of the key organizers of American political intelligence, something that I don't know, we don't have time to get into today, but the most advanced political intelligence unit, secret intelligence unit in the world in the 1770s was not British intelligence. Matter of fact, British intelligence was created to counter American intelligence, the American Intelligence Network. And John Jay and Hamilton, Washington, and a few others, largely based in New York. And of course, Franklin had been the consummate political master and conspirator of intelligence. That's how the American Revolution actually happened. It has nothing to do with most of the things that people actually talk about. It was a very well organized conspiracy. There was nothing particularly reactive about it. It had very little to do with taxation. And had very little to do with various of the other things. It wasn't a group of illiterate farmers. The American farmers were 90% literacy. And though there is the problem of slavery in America, and that's true, one has to understand that there was a significant number of free African Americans who fought in the Revolution who had been free for 100 years because of the peculiar nature of American slavery and indentured servitude. I mean, there's so many things just about the actual idea of what actually happened and who was involved in the creation of the American Revolution, which is a true international conspiracy. It's something that we have investigated. We've done a lot of writing about it, but there's all sorts of things to discover about these things. It's far from, comprehensively dealt with by us. So just wanted to take that moment. I see you dug something out, Cliff. I want to do this. I'm going to take one more question for you, and then I'm going to pose a question to everybody that has been asked by somebody which I'm going to pose to all of you, and we'll sort of close out with that. So, Cliff, if you've got something to say right now, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll give you your next question.
Okay, following what you said about Lynn, I'd recommend everybody read George Washington's farewell address. Just read it and read each paragraph and think about what he's trying to say, and unity of our country, etc., and on foreign trade, problems of internal hysteria. He calls it delusion, when politicians get delusional. So I would say read first and foremost, just read Washington's farewell address. It's well worth going sentence by sentence and thinking about what he meant. I'm gonna read, and also read the Federalist Papers from cover to cover. That gives you the thinking of Madison, Jay, and Hamilton. And so read the Federalist Papers, what the Founding Fathers themselves wrote. I'm going to just read a couple sentences from the Federalist number 6 by Hamilton. He says the causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. He says that love of power, the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power, the desire of equality and safety, rivalships and competitions of commerce between commercial nations, private passions, etc., etc. Then he talks about Pericles. Now you'll notice that today the neocons and the imperialists really like Pericles and Athenian imperialism. Well, let's just take a look at what Alexander Hamilton has to say about Pericles. The celebrated Pericles, in compliance with the resentment of a prostitute, at the expense of much blood and treasure of his countrymen, attacked, vanquished, and destroyed the city of the Samians. The same man, stimulated by private pique against the Megarenians and another nation of Greece, or to avoid prosecution, with he was threatened as an accomplice in the supposed theft of a statue of Phidias, or to get rid of accusations brought against him for dissipating the funds of the state in the purchase of popularity, etc., etc., etc. So here's Hamilton denouncing Pericles and what we would consider, Periclean imperialism. So Hamilton Federal 6 would summarize this edition, or any edition is good. That's it.
Okay, here's a question from Steve to you, and he asks this. He says, ancient Rome instituted an imperial system whereby their citizens were granted a small subsidy They chose to live on this and not work, which degraded them into a mob and degraded Rome's ethos. What do you think? Now, I don't think, and I'll just say, Cliff, that's the question. Obviously, there are many different things there, and they're not exactly precisely how this and that occurred. So why don't you just take us back through why, I mean, in taking this question, which is a real question, but also why you just chose to start with the Republic and the collapse of the Republic. You did not start with the Empire, and why,
That's right.
what your reasoning was for that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on the I mean, Roman history is really a long time, right? So we have many centuries there. So there's many different policies over many different centuries. So food policy changes, and you have the Gracchus. Yeah, it's complicated. However, the reason I mentioned the Republic is we're a republic, and some people argue, yeah, we're an empire, blah blah blah. Well, but we're a republic. We're an imperial republic at the moment. And that's why I came back to looking at the decline of the Roman Republic rather than, like Gibbon, the decline of the Roman Empire. The decline of the Roman Republic is very specific, and the factors that influenced it are very specific. The militarization, the destruction of the Constitution, the cults that came in, Isis and Mithra. I didn't mention the degeneration of culture through the theater. I didn't mention the degeneration of culture through the violent gladiatorial games. That also starts to come in. So you have the tone of society changes and the culture changes, and moves away from the original ideals. And I think I was trying to contrast today our early republic and the way people thought and felt, and you can contrast that today with the hysteria in Washington, D.C. And so our problem is, how do we move back from being this imperial republic and constantly at war, etc.? How do we move back to being a strong republic so we can defend ourselves, but being responsible and fall within what Helga emphasizes, the Westphalian model, fall within international law, fall within normal diplomatic procedures, etc., etc. So that's why I tried to contrast how we used to be in the late 18th and early 19th and mid 19th century till today, where we have, it's even horrible that we have terrible relations with Mexico. My goodness, Benito Juarez was a great friend of Abraham Lincoln's. Why should we have such terrible relations with Mexico? We need to work with Mexico. And Canada, well, we know there's a problem up in Canada with the British and all that influence, but we should be good neighbors, as Franklin Roosevelt said. We should be good neighbors here in our hemisphere, and that's another point that I didn't make before. But our own hemisphere, the Americas, the New World, we should have a cooperative relationship with the different countries. But look what we're doing, against Venezuela or some of the countries that have recently gained more progressive governments. We should be friendly with all. As Franklin Roosevelt said, we should be good neighbors with everybody and try to get along. So basically, that's my point. Let's see if we can get back to what George Washington was talking about, what Hamilton, Jay, Madison, all the founding fathers, each of the founding fathers had his own insights into things, and their wives did too. Abigail Adams, for example, had some very pronounced views. So getting back to some of our better traditions, and of course slavery is not one of our better traditions, but getting back to some of our better traditions and trying to put that forward today, because you can see every day that goes by in Washington, D.C., the hysteria, the delusion, and the insanity that's going on. And it's very dangerous. We could easily get ourselves into a major third world war. Yeah.
Okay, so this is going to be a kind of a concluding question and also remarks for everybody. I'm going to pose this to you all, and then we'll be hearing somebody else answer this question as well. Now, this is a question from Kevin. I want you all to hear it clearly and see why I want everybody to try to answer it at whatever length you like. It can be as short as you want, whatever. Don't worry about it. Hi, my name is Kevin. I have been a Schiller Institute member for over 30 years, living in Oregon State. My current work experience in mid-management at a manufacturing company brings me into personal conversations with hardworking individuals from different educational backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. I have observed that everyone I talk to agrees that the government is corrupt, the economy is broken, and that Western culture has become degraded and even anti-human. Tomorrow, we Christians will celebrate the resurrection of our Lord so that we may receive salvation after our deaths because of his great sacrifice. This sacrifice is the greatest example on how to live our lives. Our reality today is that the world is on the brink of another world war. So how do we stop it? What sacrifice must we make now to convince local, national, and international principalities and powers to stop this march toward nuclear war and the destruction of humanity? So now that's the question. So I would ask people to do is for a moment just think it through, and then think about your own experience and even some of the things we've been doing, like our interventions or the conference itself or the work you may be doing out in the street or the classes, to try to answer Kevin and his question. So let me start with Kynan, then I'll go to Cade, Issa, and then to Cliff.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I think I'll address it from the perspective of the interventions I've done with Jose and the conference that we have coming up. I'll just speak about this recent intervention. There was an event in New York City at the CUNY Graduate Center where Nancy Pelosi was being interviewed by Paul Krugman. And, you know, as we've been doing, we registered for the event. It wasn't just Jose and me. We had Daniel, our friend Dewey. We got into the event and we interrupted her. We held her accountable. And, you know, she had actually been talking about the 2008 financial crisis and how navigating through it was like going through the 9 circles of hell. And that's when I got up and I said, you know what, Pelosi, that's an excellent place for you, in the depths of hell. And Dante would agree with that. And then, you know, we went on. I mean, I mentioned the WMDs of Iraq, which she's stated on record. You know, she knew that they were false, that there were no WMDs, and yet she still refused to impeach Bush afterwards. So, I mean, and that got a lot of replay. You know, people were inspired by it. People are now finding out about town halls in their own neighborhoods and areas, and they're intervening. And that's just one example of, you know, of what a small citizen, a small, you know, private citizen can do. Just hold people accountable, you know, because there are no real questions that are asked of these people. You know, they're all softball questions. So that process, which, you know, we've started, is gaining momentum. And just on this conference, the April 15th conference, I would suggest that you go to all your friends, your family, people at work, and you get them to register for this, because there will be laid an outlook on how we can get nations to cooperate, on how we can bring economic development worldwide. And Helga has been leading this initiative, so it's important that people listen to that they consider her 10 fundamental principles, that they have a dialogue about this, you know, whether it's, you know, by themselves, with their friends, in schools, you know, wherever. So, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thanks a lot. Cade?
Yeah, in a response to Kevin, what comes to mind when thinking of what one has to sacrifice, I think you can look really to 1 Corinthians 13, that it's not anything in particular of, an amount of money or of any sort of taxation of oneself in specific, but the putting away of childish things, when in a declining culture that exhorts you toward dehumanization and infantilization, really sacrificing your self-capitulation into that, the little enjoyments of a petty neurosis that's given to you as the norm for just sort of everyday coping. That really seems the main thing one has to sacrifice, and in retrospect never seems like much of a sacrifice at all, because both as individuals in my and upcoming generations generally, and even older generations, and in where we are as a nation, and where the world is right now, where humanity is, we're at a point of development where acceding to our adulthood in the sense of the word throughout all those scales is an absolute necessity, and is just a natural thing to do. The way of holding on to these modes of lesser development on the individual and national and international scale cause nothing but ruin and self-spiraling catastrophe. So what one has to sacrifice is just the natural sacrifice of putting away those childish things, is what I'd say.
Thank you. All right, Isa?
I have so much to say on this, but I'll try to be brief. I always get excited with questions like that, because I think of Lynn and how he would say that each of us must take on the responsibility. I'm probably going to misquote him, but take on the responsibility every single day of the President of the United States, and that's how we should conduct ourselves. So that comes to mind. And also things that Schiller has said, Friedrich Schiller, the German philosopher, poet. We've been studying a lot of that, and through that we've come to this understanding of the ultimate sacrifice, which again we're respecting with Easter. And also when you look at the lives of people like Joan of Arc or Martin Luther King, who again were willing to risk their lives for this purpose, for the good, for the beautiful and the sublime, and again to allow countries to work together with peace through development and no more children dying unnecessarily because there's sanctions on Syria or what have you. That sort of thing is what comes to mind, that there really is a very large picture, but there are things that you can do every day, like read Schiller and think of yourself in a different mindset, and also just engage other people. And through these conversations, we learn and we grow.
Okay. Cliff?
Well, I'll be brief. You mentioned powers and principalities. Yes, I would say Ephesians is a good place to start. Ephesians 6 through 12. Put on the whole armor of God. I would say that we should and are trying to be good citizens. We live in a republic. We've discussed that. And as citizens, we should be active and sacrifice our time and efforts to be good citizens and active citizens and engage, just like Kainun and Jose and in the interventions, etc. They sacrifice their time and efforts and all. So being a good citizen, and that takes us to civics, etc. And in conclusion, I'd say, don't forget that it took us from 1763 to 1776 to work on public opinion throughout all the colonies. to get the public prepared and desirous of and knowing about their rights and prepared for fighting for their rights and in the War of Independence. So I would just suggest that during those 13 years, it took the colonial leaders a long time to educate the public and bring them along. And so I think we can sacrifice some of our time and efforts toward educating people. This is some of the organizing and other activities that are being done. And just to remember that, with enough time and effort, you can shift public opinion and introduce new ideas and constructive policies. That's it.
Okay. So Cade Levinson, Isa Martinez, Kainan Thistlethwaite, and Dr. Clifford Kiracofe. I want to thank you all for being with us today, and I want to thank everybody for listening. Again, we want to talk to people about the fact that next week there'll be a conference, 2 days. Citizens of the world unite. Without the development of all nations, there can be no lasting peace for the planet. If you go to the Schiller Institute site, you'll get the breakdown of the 4 panels and the concert, which will happen. It will be here in New York, by the way. You can get more information just going to the site about that concert. And as I indicated, there would be someone else who would also attempt to answer that question. And so in our closing, we will present to you Lyndon LaRouche, the economist and statesman, who's the reason that all of us actually are talking to you here today.
We are mortal. Most of us know they were born, or at least they heard a rumor to that effect. And we all know we're going to die eventually. The machinery wears down. What happens to us? And what about all those pleasures that we have, the sensory pleasures you have in between birth and death? I mean, some people do eventually take the nipple out of their mouth, and go on to other things. But what happens to this whole plenum of pleasure seeking, pleasure and pain, which some people think is important? Well, that pains me, I don't do it. That pleases me, therefore I do it constantly until it bores me, and then I do something else. Now, where does the essence of human life lie? Where does the self-interest of a human individual lie? If all that's in between birth and death were pleasure and pain. When it quits, what is there then? Only if you can do something human, not bestial, human in between birth and death, and if you can transmit the benefit of what you transmit to others in the same way, then no matter how many generations of humanity in the future, you are a permanent, efficient part of that future. You live in the future as long as society continues to take the benefit of what you transmit. You in turn live on the basis of what you have received from thousands of generations before you. Ideas of principle, notions, the very existence of a literate form of language is a product of a long process of development of language. The ability to have a language in which you can communicate ideas of a certain sophistication requires a long process of creative contributions by many generations of people, thousands of generations. And when you live and breathe and live these things, live these experiences, you are reliving in yourself a part of the continued immortal existence of that person, each of those persons from whom this has been transmitted to you. And when you go on, you say, what's important to me? Who am I? Well, what is important about you? What's important about you is what you contribute in the way of generating accumulating and transmitting these principles by means of which mankind is able to cooperate, and to cooperate in ways which increase the human species' power to exist, the power in and over nature. That's you. Therefore, what is your fundamental self-interest? Your fundamental self-interest is to make sure that what comes after you gives meaning to your having lived. It is for that reason that people who are over 55 years of age were willing to die for their nation. Not that they wish to die. They wish to survive. They wish to conquer. But they put their lives in jeopardy. And people did it in many ways, not just in battle. They put their lives in jeopardy because living as that kind of person who would be an instrument for bequeathing something of immense value to coming generations was the most important thing in their mortal existence. Therefore, they put their lives on the line for the sake of their lives and their personal identity in humanity at large. Now, the fact of the matter is, the difficulty with this sort of thing, which is, I think, more or less obvious from what I've said to most of you, the difficulty is an emotional one. Most human beings today, especially in the United States, range in moral quality from childish to infantile. See, if you're an adult as opposed to an adolescent emotionally, remember that adolescents are naturally crazy people. They're born that way. There are a few exceptions, but they're naturally born that way. If you have a person who's reached the age of 25 and they're behaving like an adolescent, you send them to a psychiatrist, obviously, right? They're crazy. But if they're 20, if you say, the first thing you say is, how old are you? If they say, I'm 13, okay, that's all right. You're normal. You're insane. That's what we expect of you. And then you have childishness, which precedes adolescence, and then infantilism, which lasts longer or shorter depending upon from case to case. Mozart got through this fairly quickly. Some people take a lot of time. Some haven't made it yet. Like Al Gore, I think he started from infantilism and worked his way backward from there. The problem is that when people are infantile or childish, their obsessions tend to run, especially if they're raised in a bad family or if they're neglected, like wolf children. They tend to run to obsession with immediate sensual gratification. And as an approximation of that, they run to a short-term thinking. Well, what will be good for me next week? Or if they may think ahead 1 year, what I'm going to get next year, what kind of a career I'm going to have. I got to get a new wife. I mean, the old wife had 2 years, that's already time for a trade-in or something like that. This is typical of the childish to infantile American. They do not locate themselves as an identity in their relationship to humanity as a whole, in a timeless sense. There's without time, without borders, in the future of humanity. Typical of the baby boomers, under 55, and I know because it was my generation that made the baby boomers immoral as a collection. They were raised by cowardly parents who told their children and taught their children to seek advantage. Do what's wise for you. Do what's good. Stay out of trouble. Don't get involved with this. There is no truth. There's only opinion. All this sort of nonsense. So the baby boomers, as I said today, was talking earlier, is that Clinton's problem is not that he doesn't know what a principle is supposed to be, but he doesn't believe in them. He's like a plea bargaining lawyer. That he goes into a session for a principal discussion and he plea bargains everything away before he even starts the fight, which is what he done again and again and again. It's a generational problem of his generation. Don't blame him for anything wrong he did. Oh, he has responsibility for it, but don't blame him. It's not his nature. It's the way he was raised. It was his generation, the baby boomer generation. So we created in the baby boomer generation, those who now occupy the top positions of power in governments and other positions around the world, we created in them a monster, which the President of the United States represents. He's typical of his generation of that stratum. Then his generation, in turn, created a worse set of generations, which you saw exhibiting its talents at Columbine High School. You have a new generation on the way, which is pre-adolescent, which is preparing to kill its grandparents, if not eat them, which are the addicts of Pokemon on the younger generation. So we have not a process of successive generations, but really I look down at this skein of history and I say successive degenerations. We become worse and worse because we become more and more remote from a moral sense of what it means to be a mature adult human being, aware that he or she is mortal, whose notion of self-interest is located in what we can do with our lives to acknowledge and perpetuate the good given to us by previous generations and to pass it on, hopefully with some improvements, to generations yet to come. And that's where the joy and maturity of life come.